We want also to take the opportunity to learn from experience and innovation elsewhere, and that's why we are delighted that our first keynote speaker is Sophie Howe. With a remit set out in law to be the guardian of the interests of future generations in Wales, Sophie is the world's only Future Generations Commissioner. And the Commissioner's interventions on land use, planning policy, major transport schemes and government housing policy is driven by her commitment to ensuring that decisions taken today are fit for the future. So I'm delighted for our first conference to ask Sophie to now speak to our conference this morning. Thanks very much, Sophie.
Well, thank you very much. And as we say in Wales, Bore da, good morning. It's I'm really thrilled to be with you and to share some of our experiences, and also listening to both and the Minister there, I can see that some of our experiences are very similar. Some of our priorities are, are very similar, and indeed our approaches. What I want to share with you, I suppose, is the approach that we're taking in Wales, which is an internationally unique approach. We're still the only country in the world to have legislated to protect the interests of future generations through our Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which was passed in our national parliament in 2015. I don't know if someone is sharing my slides, or I can share them from here. Oh, here we go. Lovely. If we could just go on to slide 2, please. So put very simply, I suppose there's an overarching principle which is set out in our legislation, which is that when taking decisions, all of our main public bodies, so that's all of our local authorities, our health boards, our national organisations like Public Health Wales, Natural Resources Wales and so on, and significantly the Welsh Government itself, must demonstrate how they're taking those decisions in a way which meet today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And why is it so important to have set that out in law? Well, I suppose there are many things, and particularly, you know, those of you working in public services, those of you working in the voluntary sector will be seeing this through your everyday working lives, that basically you are dealing now with problems that have been stored up from probably poor decision making in the past. So if you're working with children and families, you will be seeing that cycle and childhood adversity go from one generation to the next. If you're seeing, you know, if you're working in housing, you will be seeing potentially those homeless people that you're working with. Again, their problems probably could have been prevented through more integrated and collaborative interventions many years ago. So the way in which we've taken decisions, politics by its very nature is short-term electoral cycles, short-term budget cycles and so on. And that works against the interests of future generations. And if you've got to look at, one big issue here, the fact that our future generations are calling us out in respect of the damage that our generations and those before us have done to the planet, for example. So when we're in a position that we have only 11 years left to save the planet, that is really quite a significant problem, and really does demonstrate that we've not been acting in the interest of future generations. We've been acting in the short term. But like you, our legislation also sets out aspirations for the Wales that we want to leave behind to our children and our grandchildren. And our legislation was developed following a national conversation with the citizens of Wales, asking them about the Wales they want, the Wales you want. What is that? What do you want to leave behind to your children and your grandchildren? And that enabled us to work towards developing 7 national wellbeing goals. If I could have a slide, please. And I suppose we were quite fortunate at the time in that the legislation was being developed at the same time that United Nations Sustainable Development Goals were in development as well. So that, combined with our national conversation, resulted in these 7 wellbeing goals. And if you look at the kind of, the wheel there's nothing that you wouldn't agree with, very much in line with some of the things that you've been talking about already this morning. But then if you look to the left in terms of the definitions of of these goals. Some of them, many of them are really quite progressive. So I suppose, you know, if I asked you, you know, what does prosperity mean to you? What you know, give me a couple of words that describe the economy, or what we need to do in terms of the economy. And doubtless you would say, you'd say economic growth, you talk about GDP, you talk about GVA, those sorts of things. But actually, in our definition here of prosperity, we're talking about an innovative, productive and low carbon society, which recognises the limits of the global environment and therefore uses resources efficiently and proportionately, including acting on climate change. It goes on to talk about people being able to secure decent work and so on. So nowhere there does it say that actually what we should be doing in Wales is be on a quest for insatiable growth at any cost. So insatiable growth which can widen the inequality gap. And, you know, when we have the wealth of the world concentrated in the hands of a few, with 50% of the world's population living in poverty, we really do have to question some of that economic model. When we have a situation whereby, as I said, we've got 11 years left to save the planet, we really do have to question whether, you know, our model in terms of economic growth was the right one. And so the duties on our public bodies are to set objectives which maximise their contribution to all 7 of these wellbeing goals. And that's quite interesting in itself, because usually what you would get is the government would come up with a plan for a healthier Wales, and it'd be sent off to the National Health Service to deliver the Healthier Wales plan. The problem with that, of course, is that most of the things that actually make a difference to keeping us healthy and well are completely, as you know, outside of the NHS. So the World Health Organization have done some really interesting work looking at what makes a difference in terms of the inequality gap. And what they've identified is that only about 10% of what makes that difference in terms of health inequality is to do with the healthcare system. 35% is to do with social protection. So do you live in poverty? Do you have enough income to get by? 29% is to do with your living conditions. So do you live in areas of high air pollution? What's the quality of your housing like? Can you access nature and public open space? And then 19% is to do with social interaction and relationships. Do you feel like you have a sense of agency in your community? Do you feel part of your community and that you can make a difference and you can have an impact on decisions or not? And all of those things actually have a direct correlation to our health and well-being, which is why it's so important that we recognise that meeting each one of these goals is everyone's business, not that we silo it off into traditional silos. And so some of the things that we're seeing as a result of this, so we're seeing our NHS, our health boards, recognising their contribution to the environment. So you can see there that we've got a goal of a resilient Wales, which is about maintaining and enhancing biodiversity and healthy functioning ecosystems. So we've got some of our health boards working with our National Botanic Gardens to use their estate, different hospital sites and so on, to actually create space for nature. I'll give you an example in a moment of some really other interesting things where health and environment are coming together. We've got things like looking at how we meet the goal of Wales of cohesive communities, and thinking about how we can support the creative industries alongside social prescribing. So recognising that stuff around relationships, around that sort of sense of agency, and how can we use creative professionals in a way which support community well-being. Can I have the next slide, please? The other principles within our legislation then is that our public bodies have to demonstrate that they are applying these 5 ways of working. So first of all, they have to demonstrate how they're planning for the long term, or recognising the long-term impact of the things that they do. There are some specific obligations on our what are called public services boards, which sound very similar to your community planning infrastructure. So these are a culmination of all of the key public services, so local authorities, authorities, health, police, voluntary sector and so on, in each local authority area, who have to come together, first of all, to do a wellbeing assessment, so an assessment of the wellbeing of their area, both currently and in terms of future trends, scenarios and what that might mean for their area, and then to set a wellbeing plan. So that's basically the collective actions that they are going to take to get us towards those 7 national wellbeing goals. Integration is the second principle, so recognising the consequences of your action across all of the goals. So we should be thinking about, if the local authority, we've set a collective objective to reduce health inequality and improve the quality of health in our area, but then the local authority decide to close the leisure centre, they need to be thinking about what the long-term impact of that is going to be, and working with other partners to address that collectively. Collaboration, working together across the voluntary sector, private sector and public sector, recognising that no one organisation can solve some of these big societal issues alone. Prevention, so preventing problems from occurring or from getting worse. So for too often, we've kind of parked our ambulance at the bottom of a cliff and just waited on people to fall off. My last job was in policing, and my particular background is around domestic abuse. And if you look at some of the things that we do there, we spend a lot of time filling in forms and not intervening early enough to actually address any of the problems. We basically just wait until the situation escalates, and only at that point do we intervene. So we need to have earlier intervention and preventing problems from occurring. And where you think then back to integration and some of the things that I was describing there in terms of what makes a difference in terms of health, things like, are we going to invest in public transport, or are we just going to invest in roads? And if you think about the difference there across all of our goals, investing just in roads is going to keep people where there's an obesity crisis, and it's not just in Wales that we have that obesity crisis, in their cars rather than using public transport and so on. It's going to increase, if we just invest in roads, we're going to be increasing air pollution and carbon emissions. If we just invest in roads, we're likely to be disinvesting in the lowest income people who don't have access to cars. So this integration and prevention point is really about thinking in a holistic manner. And then finally involving people, and again, very much aligned with the sorts of things that you're discussing here today. If I could move on probably to about slide 9, I just want to give you, so if you want to have a look, there's my Future Generations report. So I am the Commissioner who is responsible for overseeing implementation of the legislation. I'm not part of government, I am independent. My job is to both provide advice and support to public bodies on how they implement the Act, and to monitor and assess their progress. And a large part of my role is holding people to account, so calling them out if they're not taking their decisions in a way which is aligned with the principles in this act. And we've had some really significant changes in policy and changes in direction as a result of that. What difference is it making on the ground? If you would be able to go on to slide 9 for me, just whiz through, because I'm conscious of time. I'm going to give you an example here of how this is playing out in Cardiff, our capital city. You go on to the next one, please. So this is Cardiff Council's wellbeing objectives, and they're very similar in terms of the objectives from the Public Services Board as well. So again, nothing that you can disagree with there. This is what they're aiming to do in order to meet those 7 wellbeing goals. Could I have the next slide, please? These are some of the measures that they're using for some of those objectives. So they want steps that they're intending to take. They want to reach a commitment of 50% of all journeys in Cardiff to be made sustainably. Tackle air pollution. They want to ensure that the carbon footprint in their public buildings are reducing. They want to divest their pension schemes from fossil fuels, and that's quite an interesting approach again, because it's not just the actions that our public bodies take forward in terms of service delivery, it's also their corporate actions. So if on the one hand we're saying actually we want to meet our carbon emissions targets, in the other hand your local government pension scheme is investing in fossil fuel companies, you know, one thing is likely to be cancelling out the other. So our act permeates everything that a public body does. So just back to then what Cardiff decided to do in this regard, if I could have the next slide. So first of all, the Public Service Board decided that they would sign up to those commitments. They then seconded a public health consultant into the council to lead on the development of the transportation strategy. And that's interesting for a number of reasons, because when you apply a public health lens to a transport problem, and the transport problem was we need to reduce our emissions and we need to deal with congestion in our city. When you apply that public health lens, you get a completely different set of solutions. I'm sorry about my dog barking in the background there. And so what happened as a result of that is all of the public bodies coming together realised that they actually employed around 35,000 people collectively in the city, most of whom were travelling to Cardiff during the day in unsustainable ways. So they were all coming to work in their cars and so on. So they invested in shuttle buses between different office locations. They put in bikes for hires outside all of the main public body buildings and so on. And they incentivise staff to travel sustainably. Together, they then massively increased a tenfold investment in cycle superhighways, supported by the Welsh Government. So we can see that that's collaboration there. Sorry, everyone. They seem to have been quiet now. I'm not sure if there's someone at my door. Sorry.
All right, well, that's gorgeous. Thank you very much.
They've invested in.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
All right, everybody.
Oh,
you cup of tea or something?
I'll just take and get a cup of tea.
Right, okay. Well, you got
Sorry, Claire, could you mute
Okay, sorry about all of that. Okay, so they've invested in cycle superhighways in order to get people into active travel out of their cars and using bikes and opportunities to walk and so on. And they've targeted those cycle superhighways and that investment at the areas in Cardiff with the highest levels of air pollution and the lowest levels of life expectancy. The way in which they've done that is not just by creating, you know, sort of concrete bollards in terms of cycle lanes and so on. They've worked with our Welsh Water Company to devise those cycle lanes or to develop those cycle lanes in a way which is done through installing greenery in communities, basically, so cleaning and greening communities. And in doing that, they've used sustainable urban drainage. So this is basically using nature-based solutions to take away thousands and thousands of tons of water away from what is a decrepit sewerage system which really can't cope. So they're addressing long-term issues there. And then when you use these cycle routes, you can go to the city centre. They've closed off the road outside our outside our castle to traffic. They've worked with local creatives to improve the space there, and they're providing space there for businesses to trade. So you can see here how one set of objectives that they have actually, they've used their knowledge and a range of different collaborative working opportunities to work out how, in solving this one problem around air pollution and congestion, actually can we solve multiple issues and make contributions to very many of our national wellbeing goals. I could talk a lot more about some of the things that the government itself is doing, which are, you know, very much directed towards meeting those national wellbeing goals, but I'm conscious of time and I'm aware that we are going to have an opportunity for Q&A, so I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sophie. Fascinating, actually, to learn much more about Cardiff, and I'm hoping that this is just the beginning of a new relationship with ourselves, with you in the time ahead. And I think it'll
Can I ask a question?
Sorry, we're not having questions at this point. If you could use the chat button, please, because we're going into another speaker. Okay, so thanks, Sophie, and we will come back to you later on today.